He had been the kind of man people assumed the world owed a seat to before they knew his face. Lord Nathaniel Archer carried his county like an extension of his body, the crest sewn into his cloak, the weight of years and progeny on shoulders that did not betray fatigue, and yet the first time he saw Evelyn Hart, she was bending over a counter of a stall too small to have ambitions and too full of bread to be polite about them, her hands dusted with flour like an old, modest constellation. The market near the river was a place that kept its own counsel. It had no use for opulence, only for the honest arithmetic of trade, and Nathaniel had come that morning on errands the sort of men never admit to test how the common pulse of the city beat when it had the excuse of a noble passing by. He had meant to buy nothing and to be bored in public, perform a domestic edict like a man who did charity in private, and looked bored doing it in open. He did not expect to see the way a rumour could make a woman lean into herself as if trying to make her own rib-cage small enough to fold out of the world. He watched her from behind a column of figs until something tight, an animal in him, the same thing that had made him read portents on the Morning Star when he was a child, told him not to be the kind of man who leaves a person to be consumed by a circle that will not give them back. The rumour had been planted like a seed by someone with the gloves of a surgeon, a letter carried by a servant who drank too much and told too little, a parchment with the Queen's name, and a flourish, and then the word of a liaison placed where everyone who wanted a distraction of a scandal could see it. For a week, the court chewed at the idea of it, passing the script, arguing if the hand was a mimicry of the Chancellor's or the clumsy work of a shopboy who thought himself clever. The letter's existence was a fact now, and in a kingdom where women could be punished for the currents of rumour with a severity the same as they had for stealing, Evelyn had become a thing the world would prefer to peel from the face of the day. She was not the first woman to be stripped by gossip. She would not be the last if men like him kept practicing the profession of inattention, but she was the first one in years whose eyes looked at him with the quiet plea of someone who needs a witness more than she wished for pity. Nathaniel had watched her speak to a magistrate the previous afternoon, watched the way the eyes in the room tightened as if an old habit of seeing a woman as property had been embroidered into their bones. He had known the arithmetic of scandal in his bones. Once a name met a pawnbroker's ledger of shame, it became collateral, and then debt, and finally a kind of law. He had also known privilege, which is a verb as often as it is a noun. It acts, it moves, it can shield. He found himself that morning stepping away from the safety of his cloak and the comfort of jokes, polite, in drawing rooms and into the dust and coffee smell of the market to stand at Evelyn's stall, as if he belonged there by something more than an invitation. When he crossed the space between them, the air learned a new chord, and people whose eyes had been crawling down to read scandal in the shapes of their shoes looked up like men caught mid-prayer to see if piety had become fashion. His voice was the sort of low thing that tells servants they are expected to have answers, and children they should pick up their pace. "Madam, are these your loaves?" he asked, remembering the way manners can be a kind of camouflage, and acknowledging in the same movement that the only reason he was asking was to stand where rumour could not find her without finding him first. She answered him with the kind of polite accuracy that is itself a small, defiant law. 2 loaves, 1 for tonight, and 1 saved for a morning when the city might be kinder. And in the exchange, something simple took place. She marked him as a man who could be trusted to buy bread without making a sermon of the purchase. That small transaction was already an act of mercy. He would not yet have known he would need to render much more. The court's machinery ground on. It needed an engine for its outrage in society. even when it named itself civilized, likes its narratives tidy. In that market, in that half-hour where a noble bought bread from a woman whose palms smelled of work, Nathaniel decided, with a clarity that surprised him, that he would not let Evelyn be the body the rumour ate. He had not yet mapped the cost of that decision, which is a cruelty most people practice. They make promises before knowing the price. He only knew that he would stand between her and the current, if standing meant becoming a thing the current could sink, a substitute, a shield, a sacrifice. The truth of being a man with power is that it always comes with the option to use it, and he chose to use it like an umbrella in a storm where no one else had the sense to find shelter. For a guild of whisperers, it was almost art how they constructed a narrative that could slide from the pages of a private letter into the mouth of the town. Someone had stolen intimacy, or fiction, or both, the letter, affectionate, precise, and written in a hand that enjoyed the idea of secrecy, named the Queen in a compliment that in truth had the cadence of a joke, but jokes in the court are knives with very clean edges. The very next morning, the Chancellor's clerks presented themselves at the market with a gravitas meant to scare the sun out of the sky, and one of them, a man with a pock-marked jaw and a sawtooth conscience, accused Evelyn aloud of writing the letter and of attempting to taint the dynasty's domestic sanctity. The accusation was clean as a bell in a church. It shaped itself to fit the city's appetite for moral outrage. Evelyn, only 22, nominally helpless in the currency of station, a small knot of fear made visible at the corner of her mouth, denied it. That denial fell like butter on a blade, soft, vulnerable, easily scattered. The magistrates retreated to the warmth of their robes and the rules they had been taught, as if they were the only prayer left, and the court itself, thirsty for spectacle and certain of its omniscience, opened a calendar for punishment. Nathaniel watched it all from the shadow of a stall like a man watching a trap be set with deliberation. He was the sort of noble who had been reared on the idea that honour was a ledger kept in ink and in the measure of one's words. He also believed in the older economy of human decency. This is why when the Chancellor's representative stepped forward, eyes bright with the hunger of men who read public disgrace as a form of investment, Nathaniel did what no one expected. He intervened. He walked into the square, into the ring of those who loved their own reflections most, and he said, with a voice that did not need to perform for the crowd because it carried authority, like a thing worn rather than displayed, "I will speak for her." The chamber swallowed the phrase as if it had been a prophecy, and then it asked the immediate, efficient question. By what right? Nathaniel had the right of a title and the right of a man who could make others uncomfortable with the weight of a word. He answered simply, because simplicity is the sort of armor machine-made words cannot pierce. Because I will say what is true, she is under my protection. That was a sentence that bent the geometry of their laws. The kingdom had statutes for many things, and among them was a cruelly clear law. Any noble declaring a commoner under his protection, implicitly or explicitly claiming a liaison, a promise, a tying knot in the world's order, surrendered certain privileges, the most immediate being that such an admission would require review by the Crown and, in past examples, often led to titles being called in or rights suspended because the House could not afford deviance, it could not control. Nathaniel knew this. He knew it like a man knows the depth of a river he might step into. There was no naive bravado in his action, only a measured allowance of the inevitable. He had thought in private of announcements of marriage and of quiet rooms where vows could be made and kept. He had thought less prettily of a world where he would not one day have to stand at a marketplace and choose between the comfort of his name and the integrity of another person's life. Yet there was Evelyn, fragile and fierce, and the court with its calendars and its children's game of naming who should pay in blood for the news. He stepped into the circle, put his cloak edge against the dust, and made a proclamation that would make the ink in Chancery tremble. "She is under my protection," he said again, louder, for those who lived by noise and needed it as signal. It was not a lie, it was an act designed to make a lie unnecessary. It was an admission he was prepared to make because he wanted the ledger to shift and might be willing to occupy the deficit. Whispers cracked like glass across the square. The Chancellor's face, which had been composed of the right angles of decorum, moved as if some inner thing in him had been caught unaware. "That claim must be weighed by law," he said, his voice the careful instrument of a man who believes in process. Nathaniel, who had always regarded procedure with a soldier's patience and a skeptic's eye, answered, "Wait it if you must, but do not pretend that empty calendars can refashion a person. She will not be sold to your rumour." The words were a kind of law unto themselves, and the hearing that followed was the whetstone by which public sentiment sharpened into policy. The Queen, who had been watching from a window with an interest cold enough to be weather, sent for Nathaniel that afternoon. She did not summon him because she believed the thing he had done noble. She summoned him because in courts such as theirs, any admission about the sanctity of intimacy had the power to reshape alliances and make nuisances interesting to the ledger keepers. She asked him quietly whether he had claimed Evelyn as a protection in truth or as a polite fiction. Nathaniel could have fumbled the answer into any of the good excuses a man in his place uses when he wishes to keep life uncomplicated. Instead, he said, plainly, both. That honest-minded duplicity was, in certain currencies, nearly a miracle. He wanted to watch the law summoned, and he wanted her safe. He knew the cost would arrive in a form the kingdom would understand. Titles, privileges, perhaps the comfortable isolation of a landed house. He also knew that to stand where he did and do nothing was to be a man who feeds the machinery of ruin with the quiet of his indifference. The Queen, whose laughter could be a court's weather and a crown's lightning, considered him with the thin, sharp gaze of someone who measures the bones of people. "Lords who give what they cannot afford are either saints or fools," she said, and then something like amusement passed over her face because both cases are dangerous in their own rights. Nathaniel bowed, the thing that had always conferred him rights now being offered, not to demand them but to offer them up, and left the palace with the knowledge, sharp as a coin, that he had turned a page in a book, and it might not be the one he had expected. He had not yet lost his title, no edict had been struck, but the gears were loose now, and in the shadow of a noon market he had traded the comfort of a name for the fragile human warmth of a woman whose hands smelled of bread. It is one thing to think of sacrifice as theory, it is another to taste its expense. They called it, in the newspapers that pretended to be journalistic, and in the saloons that were honest about their agendas, an indiscretion of the powerful. Lord Nathaniel Archer, that stalwart of the northern marches, had declared a common baker's daughter under his protection. The phrase, under his protection, was, by design, ambiguous. It could mean courtly guardianship, apprenticeship into a noble household, even marriage, if the public liked the romance. It could also be, in the language of those who delighted in scandal, a euphemism for a liaison. The very ambiguity was why it proved such a useful lever for men who made their livings by turning rumours into currency. Within 48 hours there were petitions, signatures gathered on the impetus of outrage, as if to make a brazen demonstration of feeling something would change the shape of a law. The Archbishop, who kept the old books chained in his library where men went to be reminded that sin still paid interest, published a treatise on the appropriate behavior of noblemen which, by last week's standards, would have been unremarkable. By Monday, it read like an indictment. Nathaniel watched these things rain down on Evelyn from the distance of an anxiety that now had personal texture. To protect her, he would have to accept not only the public slander, but the administrative machinery that would call him to account. He walked the ground of his estate with a detachment an exile learns before his banishment. The hedges remained, the servants did not speak louder than necessary, and his steward kept the accounts as if all this were merely another ledger entry. In private, some of his own family, used to the rituals of privilege, considered his action folly. His mother, who kept dinners that were social treaties, called him to the oak table one evening and asked, with the gentlest cruelty a woman can muster, whether it was love that had made him reckless. He answered that it was neither love nor simple courage, but that feeling which sometimes supplies both. Sympathy hardened into resolve. His sister, who kept a keen eye on political weather and had married well enough to be comfortable, said, in an expression that betrayed pride beneath worry, "You will lose more than reputation, brother." He blinked at her like a man who had already counted the cost and did not wish to recount it as if counting could cheapen his deed. What none of them could make him admit was the secret he kept like a shard of kindled glass. When he had spoken for Evelyn, the voice that had driven him was not only the political sense of duty he had been taught, but the small private recognition that her face, when she spoke truth, cost the world less than the lie made of it. He knew the law well enough, the old writ that said a peer declaring a commoner as close kin or conjugal partner would be reviewed for his suitability to hold a title whose lineage must be untainted in the eyes of men who are most afraid of unprinted histories. There were precedents. Men had been stripped before, gone in the night to far lands, become the tragic figures poets love. He could imagine those lines of verse, the sympathetic consternation in the mouths of bards who will always turn sacrifice into song. Yet the poems were powerless when compared to the reality of a woman's life being unmade by rumour, and in the comparison he found the answer. The Crown did not suspend him immediately. Administrative caution can seem to be a mercy when it is only a delay. For a week he lived at court as a man who is questioned for what the future might take from him. He could hear the susurrus like a tide, voices speculating on whether his house would survive the cost of his charity, whether his marriage prospects for his clever, well-bred progeny would be harmed, whether alliances built on kinship might fray at the edges. Evelyn, for all this attention, remained herself. She continued to work at the stall when the magistrate did not forbid her. She took bread from Nathaniel when he offered it, and refused to let pity decide her dignity, and sometimes she would look at him across a street and laugh like a person who has stolen a line from a book. That laugh, free, private, unrelated to the spectacle, burned a small hole in the public's ability to categorize them into a tidy story. It confused the people who invested in villainy because it made the bank of rumour more difficult to cash. Meanwhile, the man who had the courage to step into the rumour's path faced a different kind of siege, petitions, deliberations, and the formalities that bureaucracy treats as absolution. The Chancellor called a council to determine whether Nathaniel had indeed offered a confession with the intention to deceive or with the honest motive to shield another human being. The council convened in the Oak Hall, a room whose mirrors had once been the sites of rapprochements and threats. It now became the theatre of a verdict. Men with appropriate spectacles trimmed their beards, aligned their quills, and waited to render judgment. In that room, Nathaniel took his seat and found that the mechanics of law were efficient because they never asked you to feel, they only required you to account. He presented himself not as a man who sought to be punished, but as a man who had accepted the measure of his deed and could not unmake it. He explained what protection meant to him, not a fiction to be used to tidy a scandal, but an instrument to hold until truth could be separated from rumor. It was an answer that pleased historians and irritated those who preferred things to be straightforwardly punitive. Legal scholars argued about precedents, whether a declaration like Nathaniel's constituted admission of impropriety or the act of guardianship. The Archbishop wrote that the spirit of the law was to maintain lineage and order. Other committees argued that the spirit of law must be tempered by the charity of protecting those without means to shield themselves. The debate ended, as debates do, with a decision that tried to look neutral and looked anything but. Nathaniel would, for the moment, retain his title while an inquiry took the shape of a more public trial, but in the background the wheels turned and the Chancellor's men began their more practical work, finding witnesses, creating narratives, cajoling magistrates who liked to be courted as if justice were a social affair to be attended. The city's gossip, which had been content to gnaw like a rat on rumour, took on new garments. Some people admired him, calling him a principled fool. Others believed him a cad making theatre. Evelyn, by contrast, grew quieter in the mornings and busied herself with work that would not be seen as relieved or ruined by the press. She began to stitch small things, mending a boy's sleeve, embroidering a patch for a mother's fraying kerchief, and those small acts became, in Nathaniel's eyes, a form of witness more definitive than any legal affidavit. The inquiry, however, did not move at the pace of men who wish for clean endings. It moved like an old river that navigates stone by small, patient changes. Nathaniel found himself alternately lifted and ground down by the machinery of civility. Dinners at court where men spoke politely of governance while their eyes measured his capacity to hold scandal without flinching, letters from allies that read like condolences, and secret tears from servants who had once known him as a person whose hands fit the handling of ink, and still did. He had not yet technically lost his title, but the first edicts of censure were laid out with such a meticulousness that he could see how the shape of his future might be forced into a narrower and narrower throat. He did not flinch because he had already decided internally that the worst thing would not be the loss of his seat. The worst thing would be to allow Evelyn's life to become a ledger of other men's amusements. So he waited, in a sense, not passive, but very intentional, for the law to name him and for his own conscience to decide how he would wear the verdict when it descended. The city watched, the court speculated, and the Queen, who understood the currency of gestures, watched with the interest of a monarch who knows how quickly favour can be a flame and how slowly the ash of a scandal can settle. Nathaniel had traded a name for time and protection, and in return he received the first strange reward of sacrifice. The world now watched him with a new, complicated tenderness. When the Chancellor's inquiry finally came to him in a formal bed of ink and page, a document that read like a judgment already made but wanted the appearance of impartiality, Nathaniel realized the price would be not simply social, but juridical. The writ they put before him listed statutes he had known his whole life, clauses about lineage and discretion, about peerage and the maintenance of public dignity, and buried among those words a provision he had taken for law but never expected to be invoked in earnest, that any peer who publicly declared a non-peer under his protection might be subject to review by the Crown and could be stripped of title if the act was judged to have been injurious to the standing of the House. Lawyers, in their comfortable, pedantic way, like to think they are neutral. Nathaniel had experienced enough courtrooms to know that neutrality is a costume that men put on so the audience believes There is no script. He read the writ twice and then 3 times, because reading is the place where you begin to understand how a bureaucracy intends to swallow you. He understood finally that the question would not only be whether Evelyn had written the letter, but whether his declaration was an admission or protection, and whether protection could be considered an abuse of station. He could have tried to outmaneuver the law, hire fierce counsel, stage an elaborate defense, convert the narrative into a romantic drama about cross-class compassion, and thereby prevail on public sentiment. Instead, he did something many would call madness. He stepped outside procedural games and, in the quiet of an evening where the lamps were not yet lit on the avenue to the palace, he sought Evelyn at the stall where she had been the morning they first met. She was there, rolled sleeves and a quiet resilience, and when she saw him approaching there was, in her face, a question that asked whether his earlier act of protection had been sincere or a theatre. He told her the truth as frankly as a man can tell it. He had declared her under his protection, knowing the law could, and likely would, punish him. He had made the declaration to shield her from a mechanism created to humiliate and then suggest recompense. He had not imagined then how public that act would become, how many men would write epilogues to his life before he had the chance to compose his own. She listened, listening, as if she had sharpened a new kind of hearing around the great mechanisms of power. "If you lose your title for me," she said at last, not in reproach, but in the mild, astonished voice of someone hearing a promise and feeling its weighable weight, "I will not take the rest on my account." The sentence was not repentance. It was a reciprocal vow, offered not out of gratitude, but because she had watched him make the choice and knew what such a choice could demand in the terms of living. He thought of his house, the long line of men and women who had placed his name on deeds and called cattle by his crest, of the oak table where bread and political arrangements had been discussed with equal solemnity. He thought briefly of his children, who were not yet born, and of the possibility that the world could be cruel to them for the decisions of their father. Then he looked at Evelyn, at the small economy of her life, bread, stall, mourning anger against injustice, and found in that smallness a certain vastness of moral clarity. "I will not ask you to take the cost," he said, because he could not imagine a sacrifice that mattered less than shielding someone whose dignity had been at risk. "If they take the title," she answered, "let them. Do not let them take you." Their conversation stood outside the jurisprudence of the palace, as if they had been given a minute to converse privately on a hill and decide how they would be if the world stripped them away. It felt intimate and whole, and then the law, always punctual, announced its intention. A public hearing would be held, and when it convened, the city made of rumour and bread would come to see whether law would protect the vulnerable or whether law would use vulnerability to perform its own righteousness. The hearing was not like the dramas Nathaniel had practiced in his head. It was worse in ways that made better the argument that public punishment is never private. Witnesses were called who were men of moral reputation, but whose moral reputations had long ago been converted to political capital. They spoke with the caveat of civility, measured words that had the blunt usefulness of instruments. "Lord Archer, do you confess that your declaration was meant to be a concealment of an illicit relationship? Lord Archer, did you make this declaration to mislead the Crown?" The council brought in testimony from servants who had been offered coin to recall details that suited a narrative and refused to take it, and also from men who loved theatre so much they had decided to write a play in which Nathaniel was the tragic hero. He listened and answered each charge with the kind of calm that annoys men who prefer to see their victims tremble. Calm in such contexts is often mistaken for indifference. He explained, in the steadiness of a man who values language as a tool for clarity, that his declaration had been meant as protection, the shield of someone in power placed between a rumour and a life, never as a cover for indulgence. He spoke not to plead for statute, but to assert a moral arithmetic. A life was worth more than the comfort of a household's unexamined pride. The Chancellor's face read like a ledger. Men in that room were good at calculating precedents. They were less good at accounting for conscience. The Archbishop argued the theological angle, that the sanctity of lineage must be guarded lest the kingdom think its nobles free to marry beneath them. Others pointed out that if Nathaniel's action were permitted to pass without censure, it might encourage a new kind of permissiveness that would be a danger to order. The debate was fierce in the way institutional debates become fierce, more about the preservation of an idea than about the lives of the people being discussed. In the end, the council ruled with an elegance meant to look like temperance. They would not immediately strip him of his title, they declared, but they would suspend certain privileges and require a formal act of contrition to be performed in public, and followed by a period of probation. The sentence, being made by men who excel at compromise, seemed to ask for humility but deliver indignity. Nathaniel accepted their terms because he had accepted verbal currency into hunger and debt before he had realized that what he would give would not be enough. The public contrition required him to stand in the square and speak words that had the peculiar effect of making one's life smaller and yet more honest. It was a humiliation, and he chose it. He would not, he decided silently, allow Evelyn to be the only one made small that day. When he spoke, face to the crowd, voice steady as a bell, he confessed not to a lie but to a decision made for mercy. The crowd received this with the curious mixture of relief and suspicion that crowds always afford to those who disarm spectacle of its teeth. Some cheered, others threw barbs like winter. The Archbishop pronounced the theological opinion. The Chancellor wrote amendments, and his family, slowly, with the complicated economy of kin, sent letters that read like condolences. Nathaniel understood after the contrition and the ceremony that his life was different. He had been stripped not by law, but by something that looked like it. He had been divisible, and the part offered to save another had been taken. He had not yet been legally disinherited, but he bore the quiet knowledge that if the tide of rumour changed course, he might wake one day to find a writ explaining that his house would be reorganized in the interests of lineage and stability. For now, though, Evelyn still stood behind her stall, and the bread she sold remained beloved by those who came to buy it. Nathaniel had traded a measure of himself and, in return, made a life that the law might not be able to touch as easily. The irony of his position was not lost on him. Men had long constructed an idea of honour that required public visibility. He had chosen a different kind, an honour practised in market overhangs and in small acts of defence. The city, which thrives on stories with clean ends, would be slowed by that choice, and the slowed story allowed a person who had been the subject of rumour to keep being a person rather than a spectacle. That was, for Nathaniel, almost enough. The immediate consequences were not theatrical so much as painfully administrative. The Crown issued a formal reprimand that read like a gentle chisel at a statue meant to weather, and with it came a cascade of smaller indignities, access to certain councils curtailed, invitations to particular tables politely withdrawn. The steward sent a note about adjusting retainers for the estate. The county meetings he had once presided over now awaited his written endorsement instead of his casual approval at a bench. These were the ways power bored into everyday life. The levers were methodical. A misfiled grant here, a delayed shipment of timber there. His household felt the change in the absence of small luxuries. that suddenly had to be deferred. Yet none of the losses hurt like the cold distance among peers who had once smiled with his face in mind and now turned away as if a small contagious blemish had made proximity risky. For the first bitter weeks he experienced the particular grief of having name and status withdrawn without the absolute finality of a legal order. It is a liminal grief, worse because you cannot fight for precise restitution. Your property, your cattle, your very sense of identity is eaten at the edges like a loaf left uncovered. People who had once relied on the Archer name for credit now calculated what the world might look like without it, and some merchants who had extended good faith called to renegotiate as if he were a debtor rather than a landlord. All of it, he told himself, was acceptable, slight consternation from men who would prefer to measure him by his capacity to react rather than by the moral content of his decisions. Evelyn's life, by contrast, began to rearrange itself in the way of those who have been given a reprieve. She had fewer eyes on her at the stall. People who had been quick to point now looked at their shoes. Yet the market is an ecosystem of small cruelties as well as kindnesses. There were whisperers who determined that her proximity to a noble must have been the hidden architecture of a crime, and some customers who had loved her bread now walked by pretending not to notice her, as if the mere act of looking might be a contagious contagion. This, too, he accepted in the calculus. His honor was a currency he had spent in order to prevent another person's life from being catalogued as scandal should be. In the small hours, when the household torches burned low and the steward's ledgers closed for the night, Nathaniel would find himself replaying the market's geometry. The line of his body between a rumor and a woman. The way someone will always calculate the consequences better than they will predict their own gratitude. Evelyn, in the week after the council's decision, began to come to the edge of his life in a new way. She would bring him warm bread if she could catch him in the margins. She would hold conversations about the weather and the price of flour, and once about the smell of storms. Her gratitude was never performative. She had a private measure of decency that did not become ostentatious. She was grateful in the way a person is grateful for shelter in a storm, muted, precise, and deeply felt. The bond they had formed, not yet romance in the full costume of lovers, but a tenderness that made the world feel lined with reasons to be brave, grew in the odd hours between market and mansion. Yet there were moments when Nathaniel felt the true depth of his isolation, at balls where laughter found its cadence and where men with needed alliances traded smiles as if they were stones in a garden. He felt the space where he had once fit close like a vacancy carved in wood. Invitations would arrive, phrased with politeness, and an undertone that said he could come, but perhaps he ought not to bring his presence too close to fragile alliances. He let many invitations go, not from spite, but to keep the air clear of obligations he could not meet. Meanwhile, other men, less noble in action, but more deft in court politicality, saw an opportunity in his chastened state. Lord Percival Darren, a cunning man with a knack for harvesting other people's misfortunes, began to press. He made quiet overtures to allies Nathaniel once thought friend, offering them advantages now that the market had declared the Archer name in a sort of provisional invalidity. It is in these interstitial spaces where a man has lost his comfortable furniture of authority but not yet been formally disbanded, that predators of social positioning find their feasts. Nathaniel had always considered himself prepared for the political aspects of life. Hedges, alliances, marriages, these were his instruments. But he had not imagined that losing the easy ornaments of acceptance might be more painful than losing gold, because social capital buys the ability to do quietly what men must do loudly once their names are in question. Evelyn watched all this with a quiet that belonged to people who tend businesses. She was practical and not much given to grand gestures in the manner of court literature. She often spoke plainly about the small economy of living, about making loaves that would sell for the price people had after levies and fines. "Do not let them make you smaller," she said once, when he appeared at her stall in the morning, with a look of a man whose sleep had been partitioned by worry. He thought then, with a sudden sharpness, of the variety of shame. They are not all like the loud shame of scandal. Some are the small, domestic inconveniences of being treated as less capable of being trusted. It is a slow violence that becomes a habit and then a custom. He wanted to spare her even that. As the weeks unspooled, he discovered that his sacrifice had effect beyond the immediate reprieve. Gossip dwindled a little because once a noble had claimed a person, there were complexities that other gossips did not wish to account for. And yet the world of men who measure themselves by status still found tools in which to punish him: delays in clearances, the refusal of caskets of timber to be delivered on time, and a general, subtle freezing out that made the corridors of power colder. He accepted it as the legitimate cost of his choice, and while he would sometimes tremble at the thought that he had placed his family in a difficult position, he did not regret it. That is the strange arithmetic of honor. Sometimes the fractions you give away are more meaningful than the whole you keep. Months passed, and with them the seasons folded. The court moved from the cool of autumn into the brittle breath of winter, and in that halting, indifferent progress, Nathaniel discovered something he had not anticipated: how small acts can become scaffolding for the rest of a life. Evelyn's stall remained a place of busy industry. She had a small apprentice now who had a knack for kneading dough, and she had begun to keep a ledger of orders from those in town who believed, for reasons only they could articulate, in paying someone because the world is kinder when it honors its tradespeople. Nathaniel would visit sometimes at dawn, his cloak wrapped against the cold, and stand in a way that did not pry, in order to let the simple rhythm of her craft teach him that dignity is often made in repetition. He learned to make a kind of bread in the way a man learns to do a task, to demonstrate solidarity, not to be flashy, but to be present. He learned to fold dough and to breathe where the oven breathed, and in those small exercises he met the texture of existence outside of his household's grand expectations. People sometimes laugh at men who learn trades late in life as if the act were purely a novelty. Nathaniel found the activity grounding. Yet the larger machinery of the kingdom continued to amass consequences. Lord Darren, having seen how generosity can make a man vulnerable, moved to submerge his own agenda. He had designs to take lands that the Archer family administered and proposed to the crown that a stable hand of governance would be better placed in someone who was not so recently afflicted by scandal, perhaps, he suggested with a smile like a handshake between wolves himself. He manufactured committees, suggested reviews on policies, and dressed his ambition in the language of civic improvement. Men who had once been Nathaniel's colleagues began to sign petitions supporting Darren's proposals, and Nathaniel found himself quietly, inexorably, being pushed to defend not only a moral act, but also the practical holdings of his family estate. There is a kind of warfare in administration. It is not always loud. Meetings that used to be friendly over wine now included a polite ledger and a vote, and suddenly votes become weapons. He attended a hearing on the management of county roads and found that allies had become scarce because their favours had been priced in this new economy. He argued, reasonably, and with the precise facts he had always kept on file, that his stewardship had been honest and effective, and that the attacks were opportunistic. His words were not enough. the Crown's favour, once diffuse and scudded by habit, began to cluster in ways that disadvantaged those not in the exact right current. Nathaniel had choices. He could take up the gauntlet of political defence and pursue a campaign of letter-writing and alliance-making that would drain his energies and diminish his time with Evelyn. He could retreat and accept the narrowing of his life to the quiet dignity he had found in the market, or he could try to reclaim him in a different, quieter way. Evelyn, in her gentleness, recognized that the price he had paid had not only saved her, but had also opened him to new forms of vulnerability. She did not want to be the architect of his fall. She had seen the faces of parishioners who owed favours and watched as they recalibrated their obligations. One evening, when the frost lay thin on the gutters, she came to him with news as plain as shoes on a doorstep. She had learned that the person who had forged the letter was not some random hand, but someone who had once been close to Lord Darren's confidences, a scribe who owed coin to gamblers' tables and had been paid handsomely to create a document that would distract the court and let Darren's projects move forward while people looked in other directions. Her discovery was small, an overheard conversation, a coin found in an alley, a name uttered carelessly, but it pointed to a way through the forest of consequences. Nathaniel, who had been waiting for a reason and now held one, felt like a man given back a map. He knew then that the way to preserve the measure of his sacrifice was not merely to accept the losses, but to do the meticulous labour of clearing the truth so that justice might do more than temper his punishment. It might restore the balance of power that Darren sought to tip. The plan they devised was not dramatic. It was instead the slow, patient work of those who know how to knit law into evidence. They would find witnesses, show the trail of coin, and force the court to look where it had chosen not to look in its appetite for spectacle. It was a legalism arranged by moral persistence, a fight fought in rooms full of chairs and paper rather than in fields with swords. Nathaniel hired a young barrister, sharp and hungry, and Evelyn, with her modest network, began to prod the market's memory for the kind of details only those with small business acumen keep in their head. They collected testimony from tavern keepers, from the scribe's disgruntled lover who had been given no coin for his silence, and from a stable hand who had seen Darren's man slip a purse across a table like a benediction. The evidence, while not cinematic, had the kind of weight that pushes a bureaucratic scale toward a verdict. Receipts, a ledger, a witness who could place the scribe in Darren's company at the time the forged letter was produced. They compiled their case in secret because secrecy prevents the court from being a theatre where the powerful craft their own narratives. They moved quiet as rats with a purpose, and, as they worked, Nathaniel found himself increasingly grateful for the redundancy of humility. The act that had cost him his social ease was now also giving him room to do the slow things necessary to take back his life in a way that did not dishonor the impulse that had made him act in the first place. In the end, this patience became their strategy. Not to shout the truth from battlements, but to make the facts heavy enough that the room of men who loved neat stories could not avoid telling them. The formal hearing that followed their investigation was less like a duel and more like a long, careful unspooling of a spool of thread by women who had worked tapestry. It required attention and a sure hand. Nathaniel and Evelyn presented the evidence, ledgers that connected the scribe to the gamblers' tables, a panting witness who saw the scribe hand money to Darren's aid, and a set of receipts that had been carelessly stored in the scribe's trunk and later sold piecemeal to a collector with too many vices. The Crown's clerk, who loved his work and the small narrative power of documents, watched with a kind of surprised pleasure as the edifice of rumour split along the line of something solid and practical. The Chancellor, who had advocated for caution in the early days, found himself forced into a posture that required him to weigh not only the letter of the law, but the spirit. Men could manufacture scandal for political advantage, which was precisely the sort of action that threatened public order. Lord Darren, who had once smiled at Nathaniel with the condescension of a man comfortable that the world would always orbit his will, found himself on the defensive as his man was implicated in bribing and falsifying documents. Darren's defences were the usual: denials, attacks on witness credibility, the offering of alternate narratives. He attempted to make the case a matter of social jealousy, painting Nathaniel as a man who had romanticized poverty and then exploited the system's compassion for his own advantage. It was a petty strategy and a popular one in rooms where cynicism thrived, but the evidence they had collected had a certain stubborn ordinariness that made cynicism less attractive. The finer points of law can sometimes be the most blunt instruments. Documentary evidence aligned with witness testimony creates, in the eyes of courts, a pattern too ungraceful to be explained away by elegant deception. The Archbishop, who would never be accused of liking spectacle, read the deposition with a scholar's interest and then, with the world's patience, acknowledged that some scandals are indeed constructed and that denying the truth of that construction was a way of grooming injustice. The prosecutors, who at their worst mistake truth for theatre, had been replaced here by a process that felt more like meticulous housecleaning than dramatic sentencing. When the judgment came, it was a kind of quiet thunder. Lord Darren's influence was circumscribed, his man was fined and exiled from court service, and the scribe, who had prospered briefly from fraud, was taken into custody. The Crown, in a speech that combined the amenable voice of a monarch with the sharp edge of a policymaker, said that the court regretted the distress the scandal had caused, and admitted that sometimes the machinery of governance needed to do more than adjudicate. It needed to redress the harm it had allowed. That redress did not automatically translate into the immediate restoration of Nathaniel's titles and privileges. The Crown, being prudent, recognized both the noble act he had made and the need to ensure that the laws that govern order had not been too readily bent. What they did offer, however, was a form of restitution. The Chancellor's Council recommended that Nathaniel be restored in honour and reputation, and the Crown declared that the punishment he had endured would be reviewed and, in due time, certain restrictions rescinded. In essence, he had been given back to society with an asterisk, which is to say that while the machinery of the court had acted to punish the manufacturers of rumour, it had also moved with the slowness of an institution that must preserve its own credibility. Nathaniel accepted the pronouncement, not because he cared for applause, but because the results were practical. Darren's designs were blunted, the scribe could not play his role again, and the market's breath eased. Evelyn, who had watched all this with that steady human patience that is made of stoic afternoons and domestic duties, found herself relieved, not because revenge had been served, but because the space in which she could live without daily fear had been widened. They had not staged a drama that rewrote the old rules overnight. They had, instead, demonstrated that patient work and quiet courage could outmaneuver cynicism. Nathaniel, for his part, received the Crown's decision with a complex sense of victory and reservation. He had not been fully restored in the sense of the formal courtesies and the invitations that make up social life. The court moves in cycles, and forgiveness, as a political instrument, is often doled out like coin. But the important thing, the fact that Evelyn's life could continue without being the capital of rumour, had been secured. The world, which had delighted in the possibility of spectacle, found itself needing to recalculate its appetite. In the days that followed, Nathaniel's household slowly resumed its old rhythms. The steward received fewer anxious letters, the managers of the estate felt their positions secure enough to plan, and people who owed loyalty in the currency of friendship began to repair small frictions. He returned to the county meetings and was accorded the functional respect he had always earned. Yet something more profound had been altered. He had learned, in the currency of personal economy, what it means to sacrifice a measure of oneself so another could keep theirs. And he had discovered that the act was, in strange ways, both humbling and expansive. The public recognized him differently too. A portion admired him more fiercely than ever, calling him a man of principle. Another portion remained unconvinced, measuring his action as the sort of mercy that risks encouraging more dangerous acts of irresponsibility. Ever sensible, Nathaniel took both reactions in stride and devoted himself to the work of cultivation. He would not retire to the melancholy of a man nursing slights. He would rejoin the world with a sense of care. Evelyn, freed from being a target for rumour, had not changed so much as the world around her had been asked to be different. She continued with her life. She continued to sew, to sell bread, to laugh quietly at men who pretended to moral outrage from the comfort of their own ignorance. On a certain practical level they were, in the aftermath, closer than anyone expected. Companionship had come to them not as blazing, inevitable romance, but as a slow recognition that two lives could be aligned in modesty and loyalty. They travelled by foot to watch the river in spring and to buy wool in autumn. Their hands, once foreign to each other's day, had learned the language of small kindnesses. Nathaniel did not regain every right he had once assumed as his by habit, but he had something else. The knowledge that a title is a name, and names can be given back and taken, while honour is a practice that remains long after titles have been lost. The final cost, the thing he had feared in the beginning, turned out not to be the stripping of a seal, but the reckoning of a conscience. He had saved her from scandal, yes, and in the process he had risked the trappings of his class, but the loss of his title in the narrow sense was not the point. The point was that he had discovered what it meant to be noble in the truest sense of the word, to give up what you value because another's safety is more important than your comfort. The irony, beautiful and certain, was that in a society so given to measures and ledgers his sacrificial account had made him richer, in a currency the courtiers do not know how to reckon.